Hi there, I'm Christine the Gemini Stitcher and welcome to my sewing space. My vlogs are usually all about pretty fabrics and wonderful patterns that I bought and what I'm planning to do with them, and that's great. But as sewers, sometimes we need to take a step back and start looking at considered sewing. What do I mean by considered sewing? Little things that we can do when we're making our garments that will help raise the standards, take your garment from a beginner to an intermediate level or intermediate to pro, depending on what level you're at. If you incorporate these 5 simple tasks, then it will take your sewing to a new level, be more detailed, more considered, and give you a higher quality garment. We're all guilty of doing our sewing, wanting to get on with it and onto the next shiny new fabric, cut it out, do the next new pattern, and we go on and on and on. Well, I certainly do anyway. And I'm trying to take a little step back, slow down with my sewing a little bit, and add more detail into it. Just by using my time better, not by buying the next new gadget that's going to solve all my sewing problems, because 9 times out of 10 they don't, and it is just a simple case of taking your time, doing things a little bit the old-fashioned way. Sometimes takes a bit longer, but the results are superb. So what 5 things am I going to be incorporating into my sewing, and I encourage you to do the same. So we'll start at the beginning. And the beginning is when we're cutting out a pattern, and there are a couple of points that I want to make about pattern cutting and fabric cutting. So the first thing is when you've cut your pattern out, and before you pin it onto your fabric, put your iron on a low setting and iron your pattern pieces to get them perfectly flat. That way you're not going to misjudge by little creases in your fabric and end up with the sizing out. So point number 1, iron your fabric pattern pieces before you even think about putting them on any fabric. And moving on from that, the second part of point number 1, when you're pinning your pattern onto your fabric, it's getting the grain line completely straight. And I'm going to whiz the camera around in a minute and show you how I do that. The reason the grain line's on there is to help your garment to fall right and flow right on your body when it's being sewn together. So we'll whiz the camera around and I'll show you a pattern piece and how I make sure the grain line's correct. So I've just bobbed over to my dining table where I do all my cutting out, and I've got a pattern piece of the Blair dress. Now, can you see there is the grain line clearly marked with an arrow at the top and the bottom on this pattern piece. To make sure that this pattern piece is lying flat on here, you can do it by eye, and we'll just show you how you can be so wrong. So I'm thinking, yeah, that's okay. Pin at the top of the point, pin at the bottom of the point, cut that out. Now what I'm going to do now, it may be right, but we're going to measure from the top of the arrow to the edge of the fabric. And that measures 31.5 centimetres. So I'm going to do the same with the bottom of the arrow to the edge of the fabric. And that measures 31. So it's only 0.5 centimetre difference, but that grain line is skewed, it's not straight. So I'm going to put a pin in the top. I'm going to measure so that this measures exactly 31. Put the pin in the top. Don't pin the bottom. Go to the bottom arrow and measure there. Move your pattern piece until you get it exactly at 31, and then pin the bottom part of the arrow in place. Pattern piece with the grain line, I've got a pin at the top and a pin at the bottom of the grain line arrow. I can lie that flat now, and I know that that is going to be completely level on the grain line, and cut that pattern piece out. And you should do that for every pattern piece that isn't put on the fold, just to make sure that your grain line's straight, particularly with the fronts and the big pieces, the fronts and the backs of a dress, a shirt, the fronts and backs of trousers. There are grain lines on pockets and waistbands, which, you can do this with those as well, but if you do it to the main parts of your garment, it will make a difference to how the garment lies on your body. So I hope that's helped. Tip number 2 is to pattern match your pockets. If you're putting patch pockets onto a dress or a shirt, and their pattern does not quite match, it can stand out like a sore thumb. You can make an obvious error with stripes by putting them on the wonk. But if it's a pattern, like the dress I've got on, if there was a pocket here, I would want the pocket to replicate that part of the pattern on the fabric. So I'm going to whisk the camera around again and show you how I do that, and it works perfectly every time. So, getting your pocket to line up and pattern match on your garment. I've mocked up a pocket pattern piece, and it's got the line at the top, which is the fold line for when you're folding down and creating your pocket. And the first thing you need to do is fold that fold line down and mock up how your pocket is going to be when it's on your garment. I've folded it over. On your garment, you will have marked where your pocket is going to be on that pattern piece. So find those marks and line the top of the folded over pocket piece with those 2 marks. So I've done that with my pattern now. And what I'm going to do is, with a pencil or a pen, whichever you're comfortable with, trace the pattern that's on your fabric where you've placed it. Now you don't have to trace all the pattern, just the main bits. Okay, so I've now traced out part of the pattern that's going to go there on the pocket, enough so that I can identify it on my fabric. So all I need to do now is go to my piece of fabric, because we've not cut this pocket piece out yet. That's important. Don't cut them out. Trace the information on in this method first. Then use that as a template to go to your fabric, line the pattern up with the drawing on your pattern piece. Then before you cut it out, fold that back up so you've got your full pattern. Pin it, cut it out, do it single layer, and do the same again if you've got one on both sides. Maybe you'll have to retrace if the pattern's not the same. So you'll replicate what we've done with another pattern piece. Cut it out. That will then match up with the spot on your pattern where you want your pocket to be, and it will line up and pattern match on whatever garment it is that you're making. I hope that's made sense. It works for me. If you've got another way of pattern matching pockets, let us know. Tip number 3 is to always understitch where the pattern tells you, and sometimes when the pattern doesn't tell you to understitch. So what is understitching? If you don't know already, it's where you've got a seam like this, you would sew the facing right sides together, then press the seam allowance towards the facing, and on the facing only, then do a line of stitching which catches the seam into the facing and then helps it lie flat on the inside of your garment. You can also do understitching if you've got seam pockets. Some patterns don't tell you to do that, but when you've sewn the 2 pocket pieces to the front and the back, press the seam out towards the pocket bag and then sew a line of stitching from the seam to the pocket bag, and that's called understitching. And you do that on the front and the back, and it makes that side seam sit really flat and flush, and it looks great. The other thing you can do with pockets, I'll just sneak this one in there, is to put a thin piece of interfacing onto the front and the back where you're going to be sewing your pocket pieces on. That reinforces the area where the pocket is and stops it from bagging out as well. Tip number 4 is all about sewing a collar, whether it be on a jacket, a blouse, or a dress. It's going to be a focal point on your garment, and it's good to try and get it pin perfect. So here's a collar. This is from the Blair dress pattern piece. So when you're doing a collar, you cut 2 of these out in fabric and then 1 of them in interfacing, and you iron the interfacing onto one of the pattern pieces. Then it tells you to sew the collar together, right sides together, sew it together, and it tells you what the seam allowance is going to be. Now it's usually slightly smaller than the normal seams. So what I do is cut the fabric out, iron the interfacing onto one of the collar pieces. Then I check what the seam allowance is for the collar, and using a small ruler, I get the pattern piece that's got the interfacing on with the interface side up. I measure and mark the seam allowance all the way around the collar, and then pin them together and use that as my exact seam guys, and I know it's going to be perfect. The other thing to remember when you get to these corners on a collar is stitch to just before the corner, then turn it on an angle like that, stitch 2-3 stitches across, then turn it like that, and then carry on stitching along the stitch line. The reason you do that instead of going right up to the corner, turning and then sewing all the way across there is those 3 stitches there give you a little bit of wiggle room for when you're pushing the point through and help you get a perfect point on your collar. So that is tip number 4, how to get a perfect collar and perfect collar points. My 5th and final tip is one that some of you may find boring. I tend to find it boring myself, and when I don't do it, I kick myself every time because it takes time to save time, and that is so true for tip number 5. Now, it's all about hand tacking. I don't tend to do it an awful lot, but there's one area that I always do it. This dress has got a large facing on the inside, and you're told to press the facing to the inside, pin it, and then top stitch. You can see the white top stitching around the front and it goes all the way around the back. Now the instructions will just tell you to pin it down and top stitch, or even worse, tells you to pin it down and sew it from the inside. We'll deal with that issue first. The reason you can do that, and you know it's catching in your facing. However, every sewing machine has a better stitch side and a poorer stitch side. And the better stitch side is always from the needle on the top. So it's good practice if you're doing top stitching, there's a clue in the word top, is that you do it from the top of your work through to the back. So that's not so easy, is it? To feel, you can use your fingers to feel the facing, you can follow a line of pins, but it's not going to be exact. And this is an example of when I would hand tack. I would pin it from the inside, then turn it to the outside, hand tack it down exactly where I want this line of stitching to come, take the pins out, turn it right side out, follow the tacking line and top stitch it to get a perfect finish. The other time that I would use tacking when I'm trying to stitch something down is if it's attaching a waistband. When you fold it to the inside and you've got to attach that inside part, you can sew it from the inside, but you're not guaranteed to stitch in the ditch on the outside, and I like to get it stitched in the ditch. So I hand tack it down so that I know the facing is below where the seam line is on the outside, and then I can go away and stitch in the ditch and I know it's catching my waistband in. And then the third time that I would hand tack anything for finishing is if I'm doing a binding. They can be an absolute pain to get right. I recently did a quilted jacket that was all bound around the front, all bound on the shoulders, all bound at the end of the cuffs. And now you can sew the binding on the outside, turn it to the inside, absolutely fine. But my preferred method of doing it is to do it the other way round. Sew the binding to the inside, turn it to the outside, press it and top stitch it all round on the outside. Now to stop that from moving around and shifting and looking little tucks here, there and everywhere in it in the end, I hand tack that down and then I take my time and I do my top stitching. So I hope you found it interesting. I hope you've learned something from my little tips. I hope you'll agree that they aren't expensive, they just take a little bit of time, a little bit of conscious slow sewing, and it will take your sewing up a notch. If you've got any tips that you use that help your sewing, improve your sewing, please share so that we can all use them. We can't all know everything, and it's good to share our sewing tips. I hope my 5 will help your sewing skills, and I will see you all next time. Take care, love you loads, happy sewing, bye!